Hey everyone, so in today's video, it's going to be a little bit different because often you hear me talk about getting the best deal for Alberta, whether that's through independence, whether that's through statehood. But I wanted to bring up another province that has attempted this before. However, the first time they did it, they actually did make one correct move, and I want to talk about why that happened. So today we're talking about what happened in 1982 with the Constitution of Canada and why Quebec chose not to sign it.
On a sans couleur notre sang. Vive le Québec libre!
All right, so a lot of you are probably already asking, what do you mean Quebec never signed the Constitution? Well, back in 1982, when the patriation of Canada happened from the UK, Quebec decided not to sign it. And there's basically one main reason, but we're going to break it down. Because the main reason was political disagreement over the terms of patriation. Not because the Constitution excluded Quebec or because its consent was legally required, but because Quebec and at the time the Premier René Lévesque believed that it was not doing anything to benefit Quebec. So, using the assist once again of ChatGPT, the breakdown goes as follows, right? So when Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and the provincial premiers negotiated the patriation of the Constitution from the UK, Quebec's Premier René Lévesque believed the final agreement reduced Quebec's autonomy and did not respect Quebec's distinct society. Basically meaning, well, Quebec is the only French-speaking province, or the main French-speaking province in Canada, and the Constitution did not respect that culture. But more specifically, Quebec objected especially to the new Charter of Rights and Freedoms because they argued that the charter would limit the province's ability to protect French language laws, which is correct. It would shift power from provincial legislatures to the courts, which also still happens today. We see it quite often. And it would reduce Quebec's ability to maintain its cultural distinctiveness, which is starting to happen more and more. Quebec still does maintain a certain level of the French/European culture. If you've ever been to Quebec, I've spent a lot of time in Montreal. I will maintain that they do have some distinction for their culture compared to the rest of Canada. And then two, Quebec felt that it would object the amending formula. So the new rules for amending the Constitution could allow future constitutional changes without Quebec's consent, and something Quebec feared would weaken its constitutional veto and influence. And they would be correct yet again. Three, the Night of the Long Knives. So on November 4th to 5th, 1981, a last-minute deal was reached between Trudeau and 9 provinces without Quebec present. Lévesque saw this as a betrayal because he had proposed an alternative compromise earlier that day, and although Quebec was not excluded, the deal was finalized while Quebec was absent, creating a lasting perception of bad faith. And this stems quite largely from Quebec's dislike and discernment towards Ottawa and towards the rest of Canada, even today. Quebec has always felt like they were inadequate and didn't matter to the rest of Canada, which, with the last Prime Minister, you could argue is not true. But for the most part, yes, I can understand that. But the thing is here, legally Quebec did not need to sign. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1981 that a substantial degree of provincial consent was needed, but not unanimity. Because 9 out of 10 provinces agreed, the federal government could proceed. Thus, the Constitution Act in 1982 became law with or without Quebec's signature. I could very easily argue on behalf of Quebec here that even though, the federal government and the courts ruled that because there was a substantial degree of provincial consent that Quebec didn't need to sign, I would say that's wrong. I would say that no, you need the consent of every province, just like in the US, they've needed the consent of every state, right? So, essentially, that constitution was signed in 1982, and Quebec was completely left out. Hence why now they feel the need to leave the rest of Canada out with certain things that they do. So, what does this mean today for Quebec and for the rest of Canada? In short, the Constitution still fully applies in Quebec, even though Quebec never formally endorsed the 1982 deal. But on the same hand, Quebec governments have continued to symbolically withhold approval, both at a federal and sovereign level or provincial level. And several attempts at reconciliation, Meech Lake in 1990, Charlottetown in 1992, both failed. So Quebec still has a very large and very vocal and very strong independence movement. They are still ruled by a independence party in the province of Quebec. Now, you keep hearing me refer to them as a province, which technically, because they didn't sign that constitution in 1982, they aren't actually a province. They are an independent nation within a nation. They have the ability to make their own decisions while still technically being a part of Canada. This is something that they've always held as significant weight in Quebec. It's why they get so much favoritism, because the government in Ottawa and the federal government of Canada is always pining towards Quebec and always seeking to win their approval. And yet, you look out here west in the west with Alberta and Saskatchewan, and they don't seem to make the same effort. Alberta and Saskatchewan have never had the approval of the federal government. The federal government has never shown any type of favoritism or, any type of option or respect towards the West. And yet, with Quebec having more independence and more sovereignty than any of the West currently does, the federal government's always trying to win them over. Something is very, very wrong here, but Quebec did something right back in 1982. Okay, so to continue, you might be thinking or asking now, how does Quebec's non-signature affect politics in Canada today? Well, for one, it does remain a symbol of constitutional grievance. So for many Quebecers, Federalist and Sovereigntist, 1982 is remembered as a moment when Quebec was left out of a major national decision, and a sign that Canada did not fully recognize Quebec's distinct society. And I could argue that Canada right now currently does not respect Alberta's distinct society either. As a matter of fact, for quite a while they haven't. And obviously this continues to influence what ChatGPT is calling Quebec nationalism, which it's not nationalism, it's sovereignty. Debates about Quebec's status in Canada, which is, again, the push for their independence. And there will be another video coming on that very shortly, the difference between Quebec's independence movement and Alberta's independence movement, because there are similarities and differences between the two. And it also continues to influence support for sovereignty or autonomy, like we just mentioned. The other part is that it fuels periodic political tensions with Ottawa, as previously mentioned as well. And because Quebec never signed, the federal government has been cautious about constitutional reform. So they're cautious about things like reopening the Constitution, because that would be a very explosive topic. Federal leaders avoid constitutional debates unless absolutely necessary. Actually, our current federal leaders avoid debates about just about everything because, well, they don't have the answers. And Quebec premiers sometimes use non-signature to pressure Ottawa for language protections, immigration powers, or recognition of Quebec as a nation, even though Quebec is already recognized as a nation just from the fact that they did not sign that 1982 Constitution. Obviously, it also contributes to things like the No More Constitutional debates. It influences Quebec provincial politics because obviously there's the Parti Québécois, or the Coalition Party of Quebec, which is currently in power in Quebec, and obviously the Quebec Liberals, who typically hold no weight or power at all in the province of Quebec, because the Quebec Liberals still think that non-signature doesn't actually mean anything. However, we see that Quebec does have some power over their own province, given that their language laws have actually changed in recent years, where if you'd like to open business in Quebec, if you'd like to do business in Quebec, if you'd like to live in Quebec, you must learn to speak French. You must learn to fully communicate fluently in French. And I understand that, because as someone who's grown up close to Quebec, my hometown is only an hour from the Quebec border. I grew up around a lot of francophones, and personally now I believe that any immigrant coming into Canada as a whole should be learning to speak English, not the other way around. We shouldn't have to learn to speak their language. They should be speaking ours. So Quebec is fully right in what they're saying, that to live in Quebec, you should be speaking French. And of course, it doesn't affect how Canada runs legally, and Canada still functions normally. Despite the political symbolism of the 1982 Constitution, somehow it fully applies in Quebec, even if they choose to ignore it. And in short, to wrap this up, Quebec's refusal to sign the Constitution keeps constitutional politics alive. It shapes debates about Quebec's autonomy and Alberta's, and identity as well. Same with Alberta. It remains one of the key unresolved symbols in Canadian federalism, even though it doesn't really affect day-to-day legal governance. Okay, so we've gone through now everything that Quebec is saying, hearing their concerns, why they chose not to sign the Constitution of 1982. Now, I want to ask you another question. Given that Quebec never signed the 1982 Constitution, let's bring it back to Alberta. We have a strong premier now, Danielle Smith, enacting and enforcing a bunch of laws now that aim to put Alberta first, that aim to give Alberta the authority and the power to make decisions for Alberta alone, without the government of Canada having influence or power over it. Do you think that back in 1982, Alberta should not have signed that constitution? Would it have given us more weight in Canada? Would it have resulted in Alberta becoming independent back then? Some things to ponder, and I'll see you next time.